So I think that you will find that this evening is going to elucidate the differences and not the per se superiority of one over the other. That's certainly not my goal, and I don't think it's any of the panelists' goal from talking to them. I want to give you a very brief, this is the 3-minute version of polarity management. Polarity management is a very useful thing for when people get in fights about stuff and debates about stuff. Which, do you all deal with debates at all? Yeah, just a little bit. I'm thinking that there might be a polarity or several polarities going on in Scrum and Kanban. I'm not sure what they are. One of them might be evolutionary change versus revolutionary change. There might be other ones. But if you take, let's call this X, or we could call it, for an example, centralization. Centralization is a common polarity. That the other side of it is decentralization, right? So this we'll call Y. And what happens is that there's plus sizes to anything, to decentralization. To centralization, there's plus sizes, and to decentralization, there's pluses. And there's also minuses, right? And what happens is that when we fixate, if I become a zealot for this, guess what I do? I distort things so that I really amp up these. I only see the plus sides of the thing that I'm, oriented toward. And guess what? I only see the minus side of the other guy's thing, right? And guess what the other guy does? So we got over here the green zealot. And the green zealot sees all the great things about decentralization, and he sees all the bad things about centralization. And so this creates a thing that goes like this. And we don't have an honest dialogue. We don't have an honest assessment of what's really going on. We just have polarization, right? So a helpful approach is to try to see the plus sides. If you're a red zealot, just try to see the plus side of green. And if you're a green zealot, try to see the plus side of red. And also to see, if you're a green zealot, to see the negative sides of your own, and vice versa. So just a little underpinning that might help us at some point during the evening. All right. So I asked them to each first give us a little bit about their background, a little bit more that will establish why they, know a lot about whatever they know about. You want to start?
Great. So once again, I'm Brad Swanson. My Agile journey started in 1999 with XP, actually, Extreme Programming. So, which we don't have that really as part of the title of this, but XP is great, by the way, so I'll be the XP champion, the missing piece of Scrum. And since then, certainly started using Scrum several years later. Also have used Kanban and Lean, and I think like other people here, I don't see it as a black and white world. I see a lot of value in both of these frameworks or approaches, and I don't think you have to sort of view them as in opposition to one another. I have helped a lot of organizations, from large to small organizations, apply Agile principles, and to me it's really about getting back to the underlying principles, Agile principles, Lean principles, and the common values that we have, and putting those into the right context to do the right thing. So I look at Scrum and Kanban as good tools to have in my tool belt, and we'll talk later tonight about sort of what are some situations where I might perhaps choose one tool over the other, or perhaps choose to use both.
All right. So my name's Charles Bradley. I got started with Scrum in 2008 and have been coaching Scrum teams for the last 2 or 3 years. And then a few months ago, I was certified as a Scrum trainer with Scrum.org. For those of you, we live in sort of the Scrum Alliance center of the universe. So for those of you that don't know about that, that is the organization that Ken Schwaber started after, shall we say, a parting of ways with the Scrum Alliance. And he started that 3 years ago. So And I actually just got back from talking to him and the other trainers this weekend, so that was good stuff. There's some really interesting things happening on that front, of which some of them I can talk about and some of them I can't. But so look for some interesting things to come out in the coming months from scrum.org. I started out as a Java developer, and one of the things I noticed when I was a developer is that teams tended to work a lot in silos, and I kind of made it my job as a consultant, because that's what I usually was to get on site. And I always told all my clients, I'm like, I don't think of myself as a consultant, I think of myself as a member of your organization. And so I would work very hard to establish rapport with the other developers on the team and kind of get them to work together and start to ask them for advice and stuff like that. And sometimes I needed the advice and sometimes I didn't. I just wanted to get them talking. And so when Scrum came along and I was introduced to it, I went to a course of my own desire and I paid for it myself, and it was at Rally, and I noticed some of the Rally people are here today. I really loved it, and I thought, you know what, this is what software development needs. And then, of course, since then, I've grown to love it, and I wouldn't say it was my first love, but it's certainly one of my loves. And right now, it's my current love. So I know there have been newer models that have come along, but I still stick with Scrum, the one that brung me. So. I got a little metaphorical there, didn't I?
You did. Nice job, Charles.
I got a few more for you later tonight.
Okay, cool. I'll wait for them.
Yeah. Chicken and egg. Anyway.
There you go. All right, my name's Todd Sheridan. I am an Agile coach with Rally Software up in Boulder here. My journey started in, actually I was a developer since 2001, and I came out of mostly startups, and that's kind of all I wanted to work for. I didn't like going to large organizations. So my journey into Scrum and Agile was actually from more of a chaotic environment versus a waterfall versus Scrum environment. So a lot of those initial teachings didn't make sense to me, because I was like, well, we're in this chaos thing, and we want to put a little more discipline around it versus this really highly regulated kind of process and make it a little bit lighter framework. So it was an interesting transition for me going into that. But I've spent the last 8 years as a Scrum Master, an Agile coach. I even spent 1 year in there as a product owner / project manager. I don't often admit that, but I did do that. And my first 2 years with Rally, I was focused on the internal coaching for their engineering department as they transitioned from Scrum into Kanban. So definitely feel some of the stuff that you guys are going through right now. Love to talk to you, about that stuff and that journey. So I have kind of both sides of this, and my viewpoint on any of the Agile things that we do. I like to go back to the Agile Manifesto, kind of those 4 statements. And if we're doing those well, then pretty happy, and everything else is sort of a tool in the tool belt to help an organization get better. And Kanban helps with that, and Scrum helps with that. But I've been focused on Kanban the last 2.5, 3 years. So.
I just wanted to say, I worked in big organizations and there was still chaos in those. But I kind of prefer the chaos in the small organization. My name is Frank Vega, and as Alex said, I've been around a while, 25 plus years in the IT and IS side of the field of view, or the domain. The last 15 years of that has been focused on software development primarily, in roles of developer, technical lead, software architect, and also at one time a director of a web services team as well. In 2004, I started working with lean and agile type processes and practices. Definitely embraced XP as well. I think you'll get that from many of us here on the panel tonight, including though also looking at lean and agile and some Scrum as well. And in 2007, I was able to hear about the Kanban method from actually a colleague who went to Agile 2007 and heard David Anderson speak there in an open space, and came back and said, I heard about something new and I think it might be able to help us. So we started employing that, and I became excited about it, and have been trying to focus more on that side of the house, if you will, in that particular tool. As I said, last 15 years in software development, about half of that as an employee and about half of that as an independent consultant. So I still love to get my hands on the floor, in the floor, and up to my neck if I can in the code, whenever possible, when people allow me. So.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. Mm-hmm. I didn't think about it before. Do I have your all's permission to interrupt you or move you along if it feels like you're getting bogged down from my point of view?
I think so.
Yeah,
As long
absolutely.
as it's those guys.
Yeah.
All three of these
What happens
guys.
if I say no?
You can negotiate that with me.
No, I'm good. I trust you explicitly.
My job is to try to serve the entire situation, both their being able to say what they need to, and you getting as much information as possible. So, all right. So first question. And I'm going to ask you to do it in about 2 minutes, which you did the last answer in easily 2 minutes. Well, most of it.
That's because time boxing is a good thing.
So for you, and let's start with Frank, if you don't mind, Frank. What is the essence of Kanban, which might include its principles, practices, philosophy, not the whole thing, not the whole shemagegi, but just what's the essence for you of it?
Well, the good news is there's not a whole lot there, actually. It wouldn't take me long to even do the whole thing. But I think the key thing, if I wanted to get a point across tonight, is I want you to understand that the Kanban method is a change management tool. Speak louder. Excuse me. A change management tool. It's not a software development process, and so we're going to get into, I think, that a little bit more. You've already heard some of the questions that have come out already. So if I could, I just want to crystallize it right now by saying, start thinking of it as a change management tool, and then we'll take it from there.
What, can you say a little bit more about that? Because that could be treated in a whole lot of different ways.
Absolutely. So, for example, and I think the community over the last few years has been evolving as well in how we articulate what Kanban is to the broader community. And for most part, that has been in the software development community. But to make, I guess, another distinction is the Kanban method really is not about necessarily a software development process. It could be applied to other processes as well. So when I say change management, I mean more than just the software development processes in your organization. Does that help a little?
Okay.
All right.
Should we go back and forth, or should we go all Kanban?
We go back and forth. That's fine.
How about one of you, the essence of Scrum?
Sure. I'll start off there, I guess. So Scrum is based on 5 values. I like the mnemonic of C-Force, C-F-O-R-C. First value in Scrum is courage. F stands for focus. Sorry, I almost lost it there. O is openness. R, respect, and the final C would be commitment. So I think those are the values that underline Scrum. I think we would find similar values underlying Kanban as well. Scrum is a empirical framework, meaning it's based on the inspect and adapt principle for developing really anything. Like Frank mentioned regarding Kanban, Scrum is not about software specifically, although that's where it's mostly applied. You could read the entire Scrum guide, and I don't believe the word software appears in there. It certainly can be applied outside of software as well. So again, it's a framework for based on inspect and adapt for building products or managing products. It does define a few roles, a few events, and a few artifacts to give a little bit of structure there. But it really relies on, again, that lean principle and that empirical approach to improving through inspecting and adapting.
So, Frank, thanks for your statement about Kanban not being a software development method and being a change method. That might be the last time we agree tonight, but I will agree with you on that, which is not to say you can't use both in doing software development. But you know, the thing that hones it for me, and I can answer this like 20 different ways because I only have 2 minutes, right? What's the essence of Scrum? For me, it's the regular inspect and adapt, specifically the Scrum review and the retrospective that happens at the end of every sprint. You know, it's usually every 2 weeks. You know, if you think about it, that's 2 weeks, and you have a 52-week year. That's 26 retooling points you have, you know, during the year to make your process better, to make your product better, and to make it more enjoyable. And so for me, the essence of Scrum is that cyclical, empirical nature of improving, you know, and the fact that it's disciplined and regular. 26 times a year, you're going to have a shot at making things better for your team and for your company. So that's kind of what speaks to me the most. And I'm also going to allude to that later, so I decided to get it out there now.
Foreshadowing?
Yeah. I'm going to hit it home.
Building his presentation.
That's
awesome.
right.
So,
Sure.
Kanban principles for me, I'll just talk about the big 3 real quick. I'll take 30 seconds. But visualizing your workflow, limiting your WIP, and then where it hits home for me, and this goes to the retrospective process in Scrum as well, is measuring and improving. And if I boil that down to one word for Kanban, I would say it's evolve. Right? So look at where you're at, see where your processes are working, see where they're not, see where your bottlenecks are, and start to evolve that process. So some Kanban teams, they do more of a cadence-based kind of retro, but a lot of teams that I've coached before, they also have more of a signal base. So instead of 26 times to improve, you can improve 365 times if you want to, but only really choose to do it when they see a problem in their system, and they start to evolve it from there. So that's, I see value in both, but it depends on the team and how they're working with that, but I like both systems of doing that.
Todd or Frank, would you elucidate on those three principles a little bit more so that people get a sense of what they are? You went over very fast, and I'm betting not everybody knows what those are. Is that true? Yeah. So can you go a little bit deeper?
Sure, I'll go a little bit deeper. So
deeper.
Visualizing your workflow, right? And that's I do this with Scrum teams as well, but really find a place where you can actually, I can walk into a team's area during their lunch, and I'm not part of that team, and I can very quickly see or get a sense of how things are going in that system. Right? I can see where they have some blockers. I can see how much WIP they have in progress. The stories that are up on their board, I can kind of see how things are flowing across, or at least those work items, if they're not using stories. Right? So visualizing it so it's very easy to understand where a team is in their process and their projects that they're working on. And if they are geographically distributed, I can look in a tool of some sort. I won't mention any that I might be associated with, but there are plenty of tools out there where you can see that and just go in there and see very quickly how my teams are doing, how these projects are doing, how is my product doing, are we working towards our roadmap and our vision, right? That's kind of the visualization piece. If you want to take any other ones, I don't want to talk all the time.
Yeah, no, I'll take. I think you said something about evolving on that third one or improving. And I'll
measuring and improving. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll just expand on that. So, for example, one of the 6 method or properties of the Kanban method that I think Todd was alluding to there was the measure and managing flow. That's a big and key part of the Kanban method. And so we'll use terms like, for example, we'll talk about them a little bit more, for example, lead time or throughput. And Scrum has something that's equivalent to that. So a good key part of the Kanban method is definitely measuring and managing flow, because you want to have some type of baseline to know where you're at in order for you to validate that your change is actually an improvement and not just somebody's subjective idea. So one other thing that's related to that is property 6, for example, is to evolve collaboratively, but also using the scientific method as well. So that's part of the measure managing.
Yep. Yeah, and then the last principle there, limiting your WIP. Both processes do this. They both limit WIP. Scrum does it by saying, how much can we get done in a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week sprint? Kanban says, let's limit our WIP explicitly. We can only have X number of things in process, and let's start measuring how we flow work through the system with that. If we see any bottlenecks or problems, let's adjust so that we smooth out our flow a little bit better. Right? That's kind of what the 3 are, I guess, at that point.
Thank you. Gentlemen, any just a little bit further level of detail in Scrum that you want to go that would be useful, you think, at this point?
I'll go. I'll get a sense for the audience. How many of you know the basic sort of practices and roles around Scrum? Yeah, I don't need to go into it any further. I mean, everybody knows the basic ones, and I don't think we want to get too much deeper than that before we start rumbling. I'm sorry, wait, the last 5 minutes when we rumble.
Charles, don't make me put you in timeout. All right, second
penalty
question. What is the biggest misunderstanding about Kanban or Scrum from your point of view? Right.
I'm gonna say because of my background at XP and the very technical focus and technical discipline that XP brings to software development, to me the biggest misperception and the biggest, I would say, failing of Scrum is that too many organizations interpret Scrum to be, Scrum is all I need to know. If I do Scrum, I can build good software. Scrum is a framework, and by framework we mean you have to build stuff on top of that framework. Some of those things are good technical or good engineering practices, things like test-driven development, things like refactoring or continuous design improvement, things like continuous integration, maybe even pair programming, which is a great practice, by the way. And if you don't do those things, it's very difficult to build good software in short iterations or short cycles, if we're talking lean terminology. So I think that's the biggest misperception, and again, the biggest missed opportunity for organizations using Scrum is to not do those extra things you need to do to build software.
So in other words, Scrum is, we could say, agnostic about those things, and people interpret that as they don't count.
Yes.
They're not important.
As I mentioned earlier, you could read all about Scrum, and there's never any mention about software in there. It's intentionally generic, and it's also intentionally designed for you to add to the framework those elements that you need for your specific domain. If your domain is software, add some good software practices.
Anybody?
Yeah, I'll jump in on Kanban. I'll do a generic one across all Agile things, and then jump into Kanban specifically. The main one I see that's a misunderstanding, and it goes back to the Agile Manifesto, is, oh, we're Agile, so we don't do X. Like, documentation is probably the first one I see with most teams, and it's just patently wrong. That's the case, but that's across any Agile transformation you're doing with any team. At Kanban, the biggest one that I've seen is, oh, we have 3 things to do. Right, we get those things. They're pretty easy to understand at kind of a high level, which means we don't need as much discipline as Scrum, because that's 9 things, and that's hard to do. So we'll do Kanban with 3. But the reality is you need just as much discipline in any of these things to be good at it, and that goes back to Brad's point about XP practices and being technically disciplined about delivering software on these iterative cycles. Yeah, so that's the biggest failing of Kanban that I've seen, is a misunderstanding of how much discipline it requires to be successful with it.
So, I'm sorry, maybe I missed, you said the biggest misconception that is causing the biggest problem? Is that
Not necessarily.
Just biggest,
if you
okay.
want to, but I said biggest misconception about Kanban.
Okay, yeah, well, I heard the others say the failing, and I didn't know if you were looking for something that led to a fail. Okay. Well, I kind of already mentioned, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions I see, and that's looking at the Kanban method as, quote-unquote, a software development process, and then you coming in and not doing what you're currently doing, and thinking that you're going to have something to replace it with, and then you go look at the Kanban method, and similar to Scrum, you may not see something there, for example, about roles, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to eliminate the roles that you have in your organization presently. So I think it really comes back to seeing it as a change management tool, and not necessarily as something that's going to show you how to develop software per se. I think that's probably still, I'm going to keep harping on that one a little bit. I do have another one, but I will save it for a proper moment.
So it strikes me that there's a similarity between Kanban and Scrum in that sense, that they actually don't prescribe very much and that they sit on top of an existing process.
I'd like to add to that, though, Michael, because that's a good point. Charles asked, how many of you know, the basics of Scrum? How many of you know the basics of Scrum? And what, 95% of the hands went up? How many of you think you know the basics of the Kanban method? Okay, a little fewer hands, but that's better. So I think there is, you see in that distinction of hands is there's probably a little less prescription, even so more, in the Kanban method.
Charles?
So, right along, so you want me to point out the biggest failing of Kanban, is that right?
No.
Oh, okay. No, no, but I was just joking.
So not a failing necessarily.
Yeah.
It's misconception, myth, misunderstanding.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
That could lead to a problem.
right.
Absolutely.
So one thing that Scrum teams misunderstand, I think, is sort of on 2 levels. One is thinking that they can go through the mechanics of Scrum and that is going to do everything they ever wanted to do. 26 retooling points a year, right? As long as we hold those 26 retrospectives, everything's going to get better. And that's not really the case. I've certainly seen patterns where team will have the retrospective and come out with absolutely no action items to change anything. They talked. They kicked out some good ideas. They kicked out some bad ideas. They talked about what they didn't like. But then they don't come out with a plan for actually changing the way they do software. So that's a big misconception, I think, of Scrum. And the second piece of that is that I think people don't understand the difficulty level to make Scrum work well because they underestimate that software development is very complex. And that the Scrum framework is there to help you do it well. It's not to fix your problems. It's there to highlight your problems. And then you need to figure out the complexities yourself and figure out how to optimize those. Scrum just makes it visible. Then you have to actually improve. So that's kind of the 2 levels of misunderstanding that I think happen.
All right. Next question, gentlemen. Can you give an example of a client that successfully used Scrum or Kanban, and what about that client and or their situation made it a good fit? So, and if you could have an example where you think Scrum or Kanban was the better choice, not just that it was, they made great progress, but probably either method would have. if you can do that, that'd be great. I realize that might be difficult.
Well, I have kind of an anecdote along those lines. And
2 minutes each.
the premise of your question is a little bit weird because, again, the choosing between Kanban and Scrum kind of goes along with what Frank is saying, is that I don't think you should ever make that choice. I think you should use them together, or use Kanban added on with a bunch of other things to make it good, and something like that. I don't think you should say, I'm going to go one or the other. They both can work hand in hand really well. So the question itself bothers me a little bit, but nonetheless, a team that made the choice to do Scrum. So with this team, they had been doing it well for about 2 months, and it was kind of a restart. They had done it a couple years before and kind of let it go, and now they had some challenges and they needed to get organized. And so we're sitting in a retrospective and we're talking, and we're talking around topics, and this particular team had a lot of influence because it was a mobile application, had a lot of influence about how the application was actually designed. So they are always thinking about ways to make it better, more popular. So somebody speaks up at this sort of opportune moment and says, I know we have pretty good ratings on our app, but what I've noticed is we don't have a lot of ratings on our app. And I have this other app that bugs me like every, so often, maybe every month, maybe every week or whatever. At one point it says, hey, if you like our app, please go rate it. So then the conversation continued, and the long and short of it is, they said, yes, let's do that. And then they said, but let's do it after we've successfully given them some value. Okay, and so there was this one workflow where they felt like it was a high-value thing, so they waited till the very end of the workflow, and then once they knew for sure that no errors had occurred or anything, they said, hey, would you like to rate our app? The number of ratings skyrocketed. Their rank on the App Store at Apple skyrocketed. Same thing when it went out on Android. I mean, so, and that came from the team. I think that normally that would come from a product owner or somebody like that, but they were looking to really make their world better, and it was just a spontaneous conversation that kind of started somewhere, but they came out with a plan to do something different. And they did it, and it was ginormously successful. They have 4 other apps. They went and implemented the feature on their other 4 apps. And so anyway, it's an example of why Scrum worked really well for that.
And I'll give 2 examples, and then weave a common thread between both teams that did this with Kanban. And to kind of plus one Frank on, this is not just a software development process. One of these teams is the finance team. Right, and so they were struggling with just a bunch of stuff going on. They're constantly having reports asked of them from their CFO and their CEO. Accounting was working with them, getting a bunch of stuff out, and so they had a really hard time managing their workflow. Right, and they knew intuitively that they had way too much stuff in progress. We talked about Scrum and we talked about Kanban, and for them, Scrum didn't make sense. For them to actually say no for 2 weeks, to have that focus for 2 weeks on one thing, didn't make a lot of sense in their context, because they had these requests coming in constantly and kind of randomly when we actually looked at their workflow and how things came in. The other one was an IT department that had requests coming in all the time and didn't have the highest quality sort of software internally, so they're kind of always fighting fires and defects and stuff, and so there was some missing discipline around there, which was kind of a root cause there. But for Scrum also, a 1 or 2 week iteration and being able to focus on that was not how they currently worked. Right, so they both decided that they wanted to go Kanban, and wound up being pretty successful because they actually wound up seeing where their bottlenecks were in their process. They saw how much work was coming in, and they actually, with the visualization piece of Kanban, allowed their stakeholders to manage some of their prioritization as well. That helped them in just that area. And the common thread between both of them, they both did not have great safety in saying no. They didn't have safety in saying, we need to hold off on this for a week, or till next Monday to get this done. They had a CEO or a CFO talking to them and saying, I need this now. I'm in front of bankers. Get me that report by end of day. And that interrupts their flow. So what they did was they mapped it. They started measuring it and improving their flows. And they actually were on the same page, even though they had specialties within their teams. They were able to work much better together by using Kanban. Right? But again, that was their choice to use that, and they made it work for them.
Sure. So a success story that I've been involved with about 3 years, actually just about 3 years ago now, was with Ericsson Mobile Core, and they've talked about this at multiple conferences, so I can share the story now. But I was involved from the very beginning of a large transformation at Ericsson, and Ericsson at the time realized that they were struggling. They really needed to have better predictability around delivery. They really needed to improve quality, and they needed to, in a lot of ways, change the culture within the company, which was very, very hierarchical, top-down, and wasn't leveraging really the knowledge of people that were actually building their products. So through the course of this transformation, we helped the management team first make that big commitment to say, we need to make a big change here. Not just we need to sort of evolve, but we need to make some big changes within our organization that's going to help us get to that predictability, that's going to help us deliver faster and help us improve quality. And we need some structure that's going to help us do that. So in that case, I think Scrum was a great choice because we had the recognition of the need for a bigger change, and we had the commitment for management to make that change. And Scrum gave this organization, I would say, a bit of structure in terms of how they can do that. In terms of roles, in terms of how you can structure things in sprints, and inspect and adapt along the way. So this is a much longer story around the whole transformation, but and it was a multi-year journey for a 2,000-person organization, but highly successful. And there were places in the organization where they did use Kanban as well, but Scrum is where most of the teams got started and where they've really seen a lot of success, and they've certainly they've had enough success that they're out there sort of shouting out their success stories at conferences. So it's been highly successful there.
Okay. I'll try to speak up louder right from the get-go here. I think the most successful experience I had, remember I told you I've been an employee for half of this time, the last 15 years, and as a consultant. So this is one as an employee. And the very first time that we started to apply the Kanban method. And I think the reason why it was so successful for us right off the bat is because we were a pretty experienced team. I'm not going to say disciplined just yet, but a very experienced team. And we had some very well-known pain points already. And we had some hunches as to what we thought we needed to change. And so when we, quote unquote, heard about the Kanban method, it validated those hunches for us in terms of the theory of why that hunch might be right. And then we were able to experiment and validate those changes. And we started to see some of those pain points go away immediately. And in the process of that change, we weren't focused on changing roles or even the practices. It was really just tweaking upstream, what I like to call conditioning the workflow upstream, making some changes there, and then some tweaks downstream with the team, and then all of a sudden we just started to see things to flow or start flowing. And more importantly, we were able to finally, quote unquote, predict when we were going to get X number of stories done in a particular time frame, which we had never been able to do, for not for lack of trying and not for lack of taking training in courses on estimating or things like that, but it just flat out did not work in our domain. And so that was my biggest success, the experience that I could relate.
Well, I'm just curious to hear, we've got two people who say, they're on the Scrum side, two people on the Kanban side. So far, it doesn't have to be a smackdown, but so far, they're all like, wow, Scrum's awesome, Kanban's awesome, we use them both all the time, or, and so.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say all the time. And I'm prepared to talk about when I think it's good and when it's not, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay, let's go there.
And I'll even tell you where I think Scrum doesn't work really well.
Great, let's go there. Let's go to the downside of both. How about that for a nice balanced approach? Like one really not so good, not sub-optimizing, deficient, defective, small-minded, whatever you want to say, about each methodology.
You want each one of us to give one about each methodology?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the interest of balance and fairness.
So I'm sorry, I missed the question. You want us to say what didn't work, for example, about
I want you to go to the negative pole of, you couldn't see this probably very
the
well.
Kanban method?
Yeah, of both. Yeah, what's a real failing or a deficit or a defect of Kanban and also of Scrum? Because you've seen it, not so much conceptually, but you've seen it lead to a problem or like teams get totally in the wrong way because they thought something, they were using this, and it screwed them in some way. Make sense?
Could we also like hear a rebuttal when somebody has negative, you know, so
Sure.
a downside on Kanban, hear a rebuttal from.
He did say debate earlier, right?
Sure.
We didn't get SmackDown.
So I can go.
Go ahead.
So a downside of Scrum, Scrum is intentionally designed to be somewhat revolutionary, at least for organizations that are working in traditional plan-based environments. And there's a certain, I think, cultural affinity for Scrum. Organizations that already have a good collaborative culture will do well with Scrum. Organizations that have a culture of cultivation, I think, will do well with Scrum. Organizations that are very control-based, and they're very hierarchical, very big on authority, position, top-down planning and control. Scrum might not be a good fit in a culture like that. If that organization isn't ready to make a true culture change, they might not want to do Scrum. So I think that's one place where Scrum can have a weakness.
Am I supposed to rebut that?
I think what they're saying is like if we were to say something negative about Kanban,
sure.
you should rebut it,
Got it.
vice versa. I don't think.
Now, I can say something negative about Kanban too.
Well, I can't. I think that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
We're supposed to do one of
Yeah.
each.
Just smack down?
So go
Okay,
ahead.
so-
Go ahead, and then we'll have a rebuttal.
So
Bring
the word discipline has come up before. My experience and my opinion is based on that experience is that an organization that tries to do Kanban without discipline is probably going to fail. And I think somebody brought this up before. I think Kanban actually requires an organization to be more disciplined because it's less prescriptive and it's easier to say, oh, yeah, we're doing Kanban because we have some stuff on the wall and stuff kind of flows across and we limit our WIP to like 30 items at a time for a team of 3 people. So we have an explicit limit. It's 10 times the number of people on our team. So I think that's a true weakness of Kanban, and I still struggle to see, especially for an organization that's in waterfall mode, how they could use this evolutionary approach of Kanban to get to something that's agile or lean. Because if you're starting with an 18-month cycle and I throw that up on the wall and say, let's start measuring cycle time, well, hey, 18 months later, our cycle time is 18 months. What did we learn from that? It takes us a long time to get stuff out. Let's improve it.
So Scrum, you got to have a culture that supports it in some ways, of collaborative changes, and Kanban, you need to have a disciplined organization. Any rebuttals?
My first response to that is I think any team, whether you're using the Kanban method and you're using a process that necessarily isn't Scrum, I definitely would agree Kanban does require discipline, but I think Agile methods as well require discipline. If you're an XP team, if you're a good Scrum team, I would think you need discipline. So it's kind of hard for me to rebut that. I almost would say I agree with you.
Yeah, I'd even plus 2, but I'd even say if you're going to do waterfall, I'm going to bring that in here, and I am a zealot against waterfall. You have to have a disciplined team to have a good project in any process. It doesn't matter what you're doing. So yeah, I really can't rebut that. I've seen that exact same behavior. The other piece, and this is I think the downfall of Kanban is, and a specific example of lack of discipline. I've seen some teams do that mega WIP limit thing where it's like 5, 10 times what their teams are, but I've also seen teams do something more insidious, where they actually try to WIP limit themselves. And say I have a team of 5, and they say, we'll have a WIP limit of 3 or 4, we'll force pair programming and all that stuff. But then they say, well, it's a soft WIP limit, right? It's like, yeah, we'll have a WIP limit of 3, but if we go to 4, it's okay, right? Because what I've seen there time and time again is when teams start to do that and don't have the discipline about adhering to their WIP limits and feeling that pain and actually adjusting, is they stop adjusting. And they actually just get stagnant. And that's actually a really, really horrible thing. Yeah. So
to support that need of discipline, though, I mean, if a team said to me, yeah, my WIP limit's 30 and I don't know what else, but I mean, that's where the measure and manage the flow comes into. Setting your WIP limit is just the first part. Measuring and managing the flow and determining whether that WIP limit actually helped your flow rate and cut down your lead times is a big part of the Kanban method. And so as soon as somebody tells me I have a WIP limit of 30, the next thing I start to ask them is, what's your lead time with that? What was it before? What's your throughput? Things like that. And so it does take discipline. But it doesn't take a lot of what I would say heavy process. And so, for example, I've worked with teams where I come in and they say, hey, we're a Scrum team and we do point sizing and we do estimating and we're going to keep doing it. And I say, great, keep on doing it. And then I add my dates on the cards, and in a couple of weeks I have predictability on their workflow, and I don't even have to do what they're doing. And I show them that sometimes and they go, well, that's great. Sometimes they accept that and sometimes they keep on doing what they're doing. But it takes discipline, at least a little discipline, to keep track of those items going through your workflow.
All right, so you want to make a new set of...
No, I want to talk a little bit to this topic because 3 people have ignored what I would like to bring out.
Okay.
People are being a little too nice, so let me throw the smack down. So I will never be able to know for sure what Brad was going at when he said that, but he was talking specifically about WIP limits and setting them too high, and that if a team doesn't have enough discipline, they're not going to succeed very well with Kanban. So let me put a complete contrast here. In the Scrum world, something like that happens, you have a Scrum Master role specifically dedicated to dealing with those kinds of things. Okay? And this comes from a history in the software, realm where, in the waterfall you had the command and control project manager, and that was like too much structure and discipline and top down and all that. And then when RUP came along, there was like 120 artifacts, and you had to have someone tailor it, and so you had to have a process expert, and it was really difficult, and so that didn't really work either. So Scrum kind of hit in the middle and said, okay, we're going to have somebody who's responsible for keeping the discipline of the process, but they're not allowed to be a command and control leader, and they're not allowed to tailor the framework. The framework is fairly set for every team. So Scrum specifically addressed that problem in history of software development, and just laying the smack down. The way the Kanban world does that is with managers. If you read David Anderson's book on Kanban, it's manager this and manager that and manager this and manager that. And I don't have any problem with managers, but they are the process, disciplined people there that make sure everything gets done. Now, I'm sure these guys will be the first to tell you that there are a lot of self-organizing Kanban teams, and that's fine. I think that's better. But Kanban, the way David Anderson has described it, I read the book, and I don't like it anyway because I'm a big Scrum, zealot, right? But all I kept thinking is, this is a book to tell a manager how to create some metrics and impress his other manager friends. That's what this is for. And I still believe that today. Now, I think most teams aren't implementing that way, Kanban. I think they take a more self-organizing, agile approach to it, and I think that's good. But just from a pure process perspective,
bottom line, Scrum Master role for you is a strength of Scrum because it allows focus on the process and pushing without resorting to managers.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong with resorting to managers. I'm just saying that's how it's handled on the other side. And so I think that's what he was sort of getting to, is that if you don't have that discipline, then somebody has to enforce it.